Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 24, Episode 8, The Battle of Assaye. The Duke of Wellington, late in life, was asked what was his most difficult battle during all his years of soldiering. After a short pause, he replied with just one word: Assaye, his great victory against the Marathas in 1803. A hard-fought battle. He would lose a third of his men. The Indian Marathas troops were well equipped and drilled in modern tactics by mercenary European officers. Colonel Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, arrived in India in 1798. His brother Richard was serving as Governor-General. There may have been more senior officers, but patronage was everything. In 1802, Arthur was gazetted as a Major General. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I had granted a royal charter to the Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. 8 years later, they had established a trading post in Surat, 150 miles north of modern-day Mumbai. The East India Company, as it became known, soon extended its interests beyond the trading posts into the hinterland. At Plassey, Clive of India defeated the Nawab of Bengal, after which the company became a major power in the country, over the coming decades slowly exerting its presence across the region. Colonel Wellesley personally discovered the body of Tipu Sultan after the storming of Srirangapatna in 1799. With his death, the principal rival to the East India Company on the Indian subcontinent was the Maratha Empire, which controlled much of central India. The empire was splintered into various independent principalities, the senior of which was the Peshwa Baji Rao, whose seat of power was at Pune. When he was defeated by Rao Holkar during an internal power struggle, the Peshwa fled to British territory and appealed for the company's help in returning him to power. The price was agreed. The company would return the Peshwa to power, but he ceded his foreign affairs to the British and agreed to pay for 6 battalions of the company's men to be garrisoned in his territory. Given the task of restoring him to power was the newly appointed Major General Wellesley. It would be a delicate path Wellesley had to tread. The Peshwa had to be escorted back to Pune with a show of force so as to prevent him being challenged, but at the same time the other regions of Maratha should be given no reason to rise against the British. Wellesley was keen that discipline would be maintained on the march. There would be no plundering. None was necessary. He had gone to great lengths to organise the logistics of moving his force of 15,000 and another of 9,000. He instructed 10,000 gallons of a local alcoholic spirit, arak, that would be needed for his European troops, to be carried in 6-gallon kegs. 90,000 pounds of salt beef would be taken, with the same amount of biscuits. With these careful preparations, the march proved to be a swift one. Covering 600 miles in a couple of months, they reached Pune, and the Peshwa was reinstalled. Rao Holkar now raided the Hyderabad, claiming the local ruler, who also happened to be a British ally, owed him money. At the same time, other Maratha leaders protested at the agreement the Peshwa had made with the British. They argued it was unwarranted interference by the British in their business, threatening their independence. With tensions mounting, Wellesley was given both military and political control over the British affairs in this central part of India. Keen to seek a political solution, envoys were sent to attempt to negotiate and de-escalate the situation, but when no response was forthcoming, Wellesley announced he had no choice but to go to war in order to secure the interests of the British government and its allies. With the potential of a huge force facing him, Wellesley was of the opinion to act boldly. He had instructed Colonel Stevenson, his subordinate commander in Hyderabad, that they could not win a long protracted campaign, and to move forward with the company's cavalry and dash at the first party that comes in your neighbourhood. Wellesley's opening move was to seize the nearest Maratha-held fort to him at Ahmednagar. Held by a battalion of local troops led by a French officer, they were reinforced with Arab mercenaries. Adjacent was a walled village, Petta. Wellesley decided to first storm the village. He could not afford a lengthy siege. The initial attack by the 78th Highlanders was repulsed. Then a young lieutenant, Colin Campbell, scaled the ladders with a claymore and set to on the defenders at the top of the wall. Other breaches then occurred. In 20 minutes the fort was taken. One of Peshaw's officers summed up the day. "The English are a strange people, and their general a wonderful man. They came here this morning, looked at the Petta wall, walked over it, killed the garrison, and returned to breakfast. What can withstand them?" Within a few days the fort capitulated, once its walls were breached. The British now moved quickly, occupying enemy territory and securing their supply lines. Stevenson was instructed to take his 10,000 men and march into enemy territory. All the time Wellesley was trying to seize the initiative, driving forward. The Maratha were forced to pull back from their planned raid on Hyderabad. Instead, they concentrated their forces at Borkadan. Their forces were considerable, with 50,000 troops, the core of which was 3 brigades of regular troops officered by Europeans. The largest was commanded by a Hanoverian and former East India Company sergeant, now Colonel, Anthony Pohlman. A Frenchman, Colonel Jean Saleur, commanded another, and the third was commanded by Dutchman, Major John James Dupont. This force was backed up by a further 10 to 20,000 irregular infantry and 30 to 40,000 light cavalry. When Wellesley received word that the Maratha forces were concentrating close by, he rode forward with a strong cavalry escort to reconnoitre. Overlooking the vast army arrayed before him, it was clear they were breaking camp to move off. He would later tell the Governor-General it was obvious that the attack was to be no longer delayed. He had a force of around 10,000. Wellesley feared if they waited for Stevenson to join forces, the Maratha would have slipped away. A frontal assault would require the crossing of the fast-flowing Kaitna River before the British could get into range of the Maratha. Wellesley decided to march his troops east across the enemy's frontage. He believed a ford must exist near 2 villages, one either side of the river. It was an audacious move. His men were under fire from enemy cannon as they passed in front of their guns on the other side of the river. Wellesley was proved correct. A ford did exist, allowing him to get his men across the river. Meanwhile, Pohlman reformed the Maratha lines 90 degrees to face the British, one end anchored on the village of Assaye. The British faced an overwhelming cannonade from over 100 enemy artillery pieces. The attempts to bring their own guns forward to return fire proved hopeless, and all the while the infantry were repeatedly being hit with barrages of canister and grape shot. Wellesley would write, "Our bullocks and the people who were employed to draw them were shot, and they could not be drawn on, but some were, and all continued to fire as long as the fire could be of any use." With his artillery ineffectual, Wellesley ordered his men to fix bayonets and to put in an attack. The 78th Highlanders were first to see action, supported by Madras troops. Their discipline and effective musketry unsettled Pohlman's infantry, who now withdrew, then fled once the charge went in. Buoyed by sudden victory, the company's Madras troops gave chase almost into the jaws of awaiting Maratha cavalry. Disaster was averted by the steadying influence of the Highlanders, who reformed ready to receive them. Meanwhile, Wellesley galloped amongst his men. The young Lieutenant Colin Campbell recounted, "The General was in the thick of the action the whole time. I never saw a man so cool and collected as he was." It was in this opening stage of the battle he had his first horse of the day shot from under him. Mounting his fresh horse, Wellesley was compelled to ride to the northern end of his line, now closing in on Assaye. The commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Orrock, had misinterpreted his orders. Rather than move forward with the rest of the British line, he turned and marched on the heavily defended end of the Maratha line at Assaye. To compound the error, the 74th Infantry Regiment had followed. They now marched into withering enemy fire. Poleman now saw his chance and launched his cavalry at the 74th, who managed to form a square, albeit rough, sheltered behind bodies of their own dead. One officer wrote, "The pickets and the 74th Regiment were charged by a wonderful fine body of cavalry and infantry. The pickets lost all their officers except Lieutenant Colonel Orrock, and had only about 75 men left. The 74th out of 400 men, of whom only about 100 are likely to survive. Every officer of his corps, except Major Swinton and Mr. Grant, the quartermaster, were either killed or desperately wounded." With his right flank now under serious threat of collapsing, Wellesley ordered 3 of his cavalry regiments under Colonel Patrick Maxwell to charge in support of the beleaguered 74th. They crashed into the swarming Maratha cavalry, routing it, then carrying on into an immense body that surrounded the elephants carrying some of the Maratha chiefs. With his successful cavalry scattered, Wellesley regrouped his infantry and led an attack himself on Maratha guns, firing to his rear. The gunners, when originally overrun, had feigned death. Once the British were past, they had opened fire into the back of the 74th. This is where Wellesley's second horse of the day was killed, pierced by a spear. The Maratha front line now bowed backward, with their cavalry to the rear, light cavalry unsuited to the rigours of a frontal assault. With Maxwell's cavalry returned, Wellesley put in his final major assault. Maxwell was hit by canister, leading his men forward, blunting the assault, but they did manage to gain possession of the enemy cannon until they were relieved by the infantry coming up. Much of the British infantry had already marched 25 miles earlier in the day, and the day was hot when they put in their final assault as a single line. Poleman's men did not wait to receive them. Seeing many of their European officers retiring from the field, the soldiers joined them, and the Maratha battalions disintegrated. The British cavalry were too exhausted to pursue. The British had lost 1,584 dead and wounded, the Maratha perhaps 6,000, and all their guns. Of Wellesley's own staff of 10, 8 had been injured. The Maratha army still existed as a fighting force, but many of the European officers now defected to the East India Company, who offered amnesty to them. Poleman took up the offer and re-entered service with the East India Company as a lieutenant colonel. He'd come a long way since he arrived in India as a sergeant. Assaye is seen as a decisive battle in the establishment of British influence and power in central India, and it established Wellesley's. 2 months after the victory and another 3 actions, the Maratha chiefs sued for peace. While the victory is still remembered each year by the Royal Highland Fusiliers, the engagement is now largely forgotten. Colonel Patrick Maxwell, killed leading his cavalry, is buried on the site of battle, his grave marked with a headstone whose words are now no longer visible. Thanks for listening. Don't forget, you can write a script for us if you'd like. Many scripts over the years have been written by listeners such as yourself, and we really do love getting them. If you have an idea and would like to turn it into a script but aren't quite sure where to start, then just drop us a line anyway, and we can help you get it written. Also, do go to thehistorynetwork.org or to our Facebook page. Just search for The History Network on Facebook, and you can find out about all our other podcasts there. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Angus Wallace, read by Nick Barker.